All right, hello everyone, it's Fahim here, and in today's video we are going to start to look at joints in a bit more depth, and the focus is going to be on the fibrous type of joint. So let's get into this, and I'm just going to get my slides prepared. Here we go, all good to go. And my computer has been running a bit slow, so I do apologize if it's playing up a bit, but let's get right into this. So in this video, essentially, we are looking at fibrous joints itself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fahim. I'm a pharmacy prescriber, contractor, and founder of MedLearn. So this is our vision, is we want to upskill and develop pharmacists, allied healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, so we can all be the best versions of ourselves and really build a better world. So joints itself. Now, in the previous video, I started to explain to you a bit about joints, and I started to really paint a bigger picture, because I don't feel that this is something that you need to memorize, but rather understand the concepts, because when you understand concepts, things become a lot easier. And one of the areas that I struggled with in anatomy was I couldn't differentiate between the concepts I've got to understand and the facts. And this, what we're talking about today, is a concept that you have to understand. So remember, as I explained in the last video, that we've got these different type of joints. Essentially what we have, think of a joint as let's say we've got two pieces of bone here, and there's got to be some sort of connection between them. Now that connection could be like this, kind of towards the sides here. So we don't necessarily have a connection in between. So we don't have anything like this going in between, connecting them. Or what it could be is we could have something like this, where we have a bone, and let's change the color to make it a bit more fun. There we go, we've got two bones here, and in between them, we actually have a connection. And for example, there's a connection here. In between them, there's actually some sort of solid connection between them. And in this video, we're going to be focusing on this type of connection here, where you have these two bones, okay? And in between them, you can imagine like this, there's actually a connection in between them like that. So you can imagine there's a phone and there's a bridge, some sort of connection here. And this sort of connection that we're talking about in today's video is going to be a fibrous joint. Fibrous joint. So in terms of a bigger picture, we've got two bones that are connected together by some sort of solid tissue. And this tissue is, and if you're wondering how I remember this, it's the I here and the R here reminds me of dense, irregular connective tissue. And that's how I know. Again, this is a fact that you have to know, but the mnemonic does help, or this sort of looking at the term and putting attaching certain things to it does make it easier to remember. And that's how I know that this is a dense, irregular connective tissue. So in between here, like this, we have that dense, irregular connective tissue. And this is essentially a fibrous joint itself. Now remember, in the previous video, I spoke how we can classify joints, and they can be classified based on function or structure. And when we're talking about function, essentially we're talking about the range of motion that's available, the range of motion. So I'll put ROM. And if you don't remember what these are, I'll quickly remind you. You can have something that where we have practically no range of motion, and we can call it a synarthrosis, or you can have something that we have very little movement, and we can say it's an amphiarthrosis, and we can have somewhere where we have a lot of movement, and it's a diarthrosis. And remember, syn means between, amphi means both, and di means between. So syn also actually, the word syn itself actually means together or between. Amphi essentially means both, and di can also mean like between or has both sort of connection. So that's important there. And remember that syn would be no movement at all. So we'll put N for no here. Amphi means some movement, some. And here we have di, and di would mean we have a lot of movement. And see if you can think of some joints that are or would be classed as a diarthrosis. See if you can make that connection. Now, based on structure, essentially it's where we look at the structure, we classify the structure itself. And in this case, with these fibrous joints, we have three. So one would be sutures. The other one will be here. And this board is getting a bit messy, so let's delete this. There we go. So fibrous joint, we're going to have sutures here. We can have a gomphosis, and I'll explain that in a second there. And we can have a syndesmosis, which is here. These are the three. So I'll write these down for you. So based on structure, we can look at these joints and they can be classed as sutures. They can be classed as gomphosis, bit of a cool term, and syndesmosis. And if you remember the previous video where I spoke to you about Latin, syndesmosis means band, like a band-like. And if you have a look here, there's a bit of a band here going on, as you can see. This is known as syndesmosis. That's why knowing the Latin makes it easier. A gomphosis, if you remember the last video I spoke about, like a peg in socket. And we can see that the tooth acts like a peg. So this peg is inside a socket, and here's a socket. So we can see that's a gomphosis. And a suture means like a beam, or rather not a beam, sorry, a seam. A beam is actually a trabeculi. We'll discuss that. I was just doing some studying on various types of tissue, various types of bone tissue, and that's why that was coming into my mind. But essentially, this is like a seam, and you can see we've got a seam here. It's like a seam, and essentially in a suture, you've got the bone. So let's say this is the bone here, and we find this in the skull, like there's the bone, and connecting these in between, you have a connection, and it's not a lot. The fibers there's not much room, but you have a connection like this, and that is going to be like a seam, you can see. And normally they close up and they tend to be covered by, or they tend to form a bone, and we tend to have a different joint there later on. So this joint itself is a suture joint. We have a suture ligament. So it's a suture, I'm just going to put SL for a suture ligament. But essentially what ends up happening is that the ligament can actually start to change, and we actually get bone deposition here, and it starts to become into a bone. So keep that in mind. But for now, just remember that we have a ligament in between, and it's not a lot of space. So there's not much space. That's why the movement is very, very little. And actually, in fact, there's no movement here because the fibers are so close together. There's no movement. A gomphosis, you can see the same concept here. You've got the fibers like this that are running. And essentially, this is a periodontal ligament. So there's the term periodontal. It's a periodontal ligament. And again, we've got a bit more room to maneuver. And there isn't really much movement, but there's enough for you to sense when your tooth is moving. And you know yourself, if you're trying to move your tooth, the tooth shouldn't move. If it's moving, it's wobbling, it's not a good sign. But this is a gomphosis. So it's very, very little movement. And the movement is only there when there's a pathology, when you can sense it, or more for proprioception. But we'll discuss that concept later. But for now, just remember, we've got suture, it's combined, no movement. Gomphosis, again, we have a band-like, or rather a fibrous joint, like a solid kind of joint. It's a bit more space, so the fibers are a bit more, you can say, longer. So there is apparently a bit of movement. And then we have a syndesmosis, we have a band, and the band is here. And with this, actually, again, there's a band-like structure. It does give a bit more flexibility, but again, very, very little movement itself. So that's your joint there. So you've learned today about a fibrous joint. What is a fibrous joint? A fibrous joint, you should think of, you have a bone like this, bone 1, bone 2, and there's actually like a physical connection going on here. So these are physically connected here. There's a physical connection here. We can also have another kind of joint, which is like a synovial joint. And I explained that to you, that there isn't a direct connection in between the bones itself, but it's towards the sides. And I drew that out for you. So you can imagine here and here, and the connection is going to be to the sides here. And then the other type of that is cartilaginous joint, and we'll discuss that later. I hope you found this video useful, but for exam prep, make sure you do understand what is a fibrous joint. In the next video, we're going to start to look at the synovial joint and the cartilaginous joint. Thank you very much for watching.